which brings us to today. So today we're looking at the limits to hashkafa, right? Where are the boundaries around your worldview? Where are the boundaries around what's acceptable for your interpretation of halacha? Because they're there. And we're going to look at a really foundational, very important piece of Mishnah that, as I was saying a moment ago, I don't want to make any assumptions. So I'm going to cancel what I said because it's not on the record. Okay. So we're going to look at least in traditional Jewish theology, a pretty foundational text. It's from the section of the Mishnah in the Talmud called Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is the name for basically like the Supreme Court, the kind of assembly of elders who would adjudicate cases in antiquity. Right, in Judaism. Napoleon tried to resurrect it, didn't work so well. So we don't have a Sanhedrin anymore, but we do have kind of the texts associated with it. Although I'll just say one thing, that the very nature of like how it worked is kind of in a shadowy period in Jewish history. So we don't know a lot about it, but we do know that it existed, and that it was a kind of a deliberative body that would adjudicate different cases. Okay. Who hasn't been here? Carla, can you kick us off with the Mishnah here? And we'll read through the whole thing, and then we'll go back and we'll kind of unpack different words and concepts.
All of the Jewish people have a share in the world to come, as it is stated, and your people shall also be righteous. Your people also shall be all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever. The branch of my planting, the work of my hands, for my name to be glorified. Isaiah 60:21. And these are those exceptions who have no share in the world to come. One who says there is no resurrection of the dead from the Torah, and Torah did not originate from heaven, and an apikoros.
Okay. So the Mishnah here sets up two interesting ideas. The first is, it says, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek leolam haba. All of Israel, all the Jewish people have a share in the world to come. So the first is the assumption that there is a world to come. Now you may have heard there's kind of a popular notion that Judaism isn't so focused on the afterlife compared to like Christianity, for example, or to Islam, for example. Have people heard that? There's something said to that degree before. So it's kind of not true. The Talmud talks a lot about Olam Haba, the world to come. The difference when you compare Judaism, which is not a universalizing tradition, meaning the goal of Judaism is not to get everybody else to believe in Judaism. When you compare it to Christianity or Islam, which are both universalizing traditions, while Judaism talks plenty about Olam Haba, it's not focused on it as the end goal, right? The goal of your life is not to get in to heaven. Whereas in Christianity and Islam, those tend to be, I'm being very, very kind of reductionist here, but in terms of just contrasting ideas. So Judaism, the Talmud does talk a lot about Olam Haba. And right here in the Mishnah, you have this as like everybody has a share, right? Everybody is entitled to get in. How do we know that? And the source text comes from Isaiah. Isaiah is often a ripe part of the Tanakh when looking for like messianic texts. There's lots of this language of, first of all, there's this idea that everybody will inherit forever. But then there's the idea of this branch of planting, meaning, this is understood to be like you plant something now, but it extends like all the way long through future generations. This is where lots of messianic ideas are rooted in Judaism, but also this idea that everybody gets a share in the world to come. So that's the first idea. Everybody gets to go there, whatever it is. But then there's immediately a second idea, which is like, it's always very interesting to see this, because literally the Mishnah starts off by saying, Kol Yisrael, all Jews. And then it immediately goes, except for these ones, right? These are the exceptions to the rule. So, we'll talk about who those three different groups are in a moment. But I want to say one thing. This is not a class in theology or in kind of Jewish views of the afterlife. So we're not going to spend too much time talking, well, how do we know this? And what does this look like? And like, that's a topic for a separate class. But the only thing that I want to say on that that might help us understand this is even when you see something very restrictive like this, that seems to say like, this is the group of people who don't have a share in the world to come, generally it's all like massaged out in such a way that like everybody gets there. And I'll say one thing about this that might be interesting given what people, given Jewish ritual practices that people are familiar with. So the idea is that even these people who don't have a share in the world to come, according to the Mishnah, probably ultimately the rabbis understand that they would get there. So the question is how? And there is a belief. It is not like this huge, well-rounded, fully fleshed out belief about the nature of the afterlife, but it has a resonant impact on a practice which many of us may have seen. And it goes like this. There's the idea that in Judaism, there's some form of, the English or Christian term would be purgatory. That's probably not the best way to describe it. We can think of it maybe more like a waiting room or a cleansing period. But there is an idea that even kind of the most egregious offenders, according to Jewish law, when they die, go through their soul, which is pure, right? Everybody's soul is fundamentally pure. It's our actions which cloud that. It's our actions which distort that. But the essence of each person in Judaism is 100% foundationally blemish free. That's a really important part of Jewish kind of spiritual thought. And you bear responsibility for your actions, but the core of who you are is untarnishable. So the idea is that this is an idea developed later in mysticism, that when that soul returns to its roots, when it goes to Olam Haba, it goes through a period of cleansing to its original state. And the rabbis imagine that the period would take up to a year, right? It could take up to a year for that to happen. That would be the year of saying Kaddish after the death of someone, which is why many people believe that saying Kaddish actually has some form of impact on the soul of the deceased. And one of the ideas is that for the most kind of egregious offenders, it would take the full year of that time. So has anybody seen the practice where you only say Kaddish for 11 months after somebody dies?
Mm-hmm.
This is the reason why. Why would you only say it for 11 months? Because if you said it for 12 months, it would be signaling that the person who died was amongst those most egregious sinners, right? And so if you only say it for 11 months, it's a way of signaling that like they are not that kind of person. Right? Why am I sharing that in this class? Well, one, because it's an interesting, like something that we may have seen before and didn't know where it came from. But two, because it's tied to the idea, if we're going to talk about the afterlife, it's really important to contrast it with kind of like whatever ideas we might have imbibed from the broader non-Jewish culture. And one of the ideas in Judaism is basically that's a place everybody gets to go, right? Even when you see very bold statements like this, at the end of the day, everyone gets to go there. And that's kind of fleshed out in Kabbalah and later rabbinic thought. But that's the last thing we're going to talk about, the nature of the afterlife. Really here, what we're talking about is what are the boundaries around kind of your ability to personally interpret this. Okay. So let's go back to this Mishnah. What do people notice about it? What's curious to you, either in like how it's constructed or what you are and aren't allowed to do? And then we're going to talk about these three categories of people who aren't allowed or who don't have a share in the cup. Yeah, Vanix.
Well, first of all, is in some ways is the afterlife not the messianic life, not the afterlife, the Olam Haba?
Yeah.
Is that not the messianic age? Number one, and to directly or sort of indirectly answer your question, Reformed Jews can't get there because Reformed Jews do not, for the most part, believe in the resurrection of the dead, and also do not believe that Torah was divinely written.
Well, apparently neither did people at the time this was composed, right? Because there's clearly this admonition against them. So apparently there's lots of people before 18th century Germany who didn't think that either. Yeah, there's a distinction between like the Olam Haba and then like the period of the coming of the Messiah. And like, obviously there are dead people who have died now, and as far as we know, the Messiah has not come. So like, where are they? But that's a bit of a separate topic, and actually, that would be a great Talmud class, like Talmudic views of the afterlife. Yeah, lots of people are excluded here, but remember, it gets softened, right? Like, ultimately, there's an acceptance that like these people go in, that everybody does.
Yeah, the structure of it's a little bit interesting because, it says everyone's included. Oh, but wait. Whereas it could say, these are the people who are included. These are the people who are excluded. So it's I guess sort of overall more positive. If you only read the first part of it, you'd think I'll get in.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, the interesting thing is this Greek word at the very end of it. So
it is Greek.
Yeah. So I'm assuming this refers to Epicureans. Would that be?
It does refer to Epicureans.
So these, if my memory serves me correctly, are people who live for the moment, who aren't concerned about things beyond the enjoyment of everyday life. Am I right on that?
Maybe. Let's talk about Epicureanism.
Or if the fact that it's a Greek word somehow suggests that these are people who are outside in some way.
Definitely that.
Yeah.
Epicurus, it means two things. First of all, it comes to mean heretic, right? So today, if you call someone an Epicurus in Yiddish, you're calling someone a heretic, right? And it's kind of like one of the worst things you could be called. Like it's pretty bad. But where does that come from? It's a Greek word, and it comes from a Greek philosophy. Does anybody know anything about Epicurean philosophy?
Isn't it?
Yeah, Carla.
Isn't it where you live for today, because Epicurus said, life is short, so enjoy it and get the most out of it that you can. It's ultimately kind of a selfish philosophy for my way of thinking.
Yeah, so you and my mom had both heard that. So the question would be like, well, where does that idea come from? And this is what's really important, right? Here's our, that you didn't know you would be having a 101 in Greek philosophy at 9:20 in the morning on Thursday. One of the core ideas of Epicurean philosophy was it was one of the first attempts to do what today we would call like subatomic particle physics, right? And the Epicureans believed that everything in the cosmos, or in the visible universe, let's say, was made up of tiny, today we would say atoms. I guess, like, they believed that they were made up of like little particles. And that basically everything functioned based on the interaction of like these little particles, right? And that all you really needed to do to understand how the universe worked was to see like, oh, what bumped into what particle and pushed it in what direction. And this is, again, like very reductionist. Wikipedia is your friend if you want to learn more about Epicurean philosophy. But the idea was, functionally, there's a randomness. The universe is ordered, but it's really just based on kind of the automatic kind of functioning of all of these little particles. Like, things happen because things bump into each other, and that's cause and effect. This is a huge problem for the rabbis. First of all, Epicurean philosophy is very popular, right? It really, really takes off. And part of it might have had to do with like the hedonism that you're referring to, because the idea was like, well, look, if the universe functions just because like A causes B, which causes C, which causes T, then the ultimate principle is let's just maximize pleasure, right? Like, because that's how life functions. So lots of Jews get attracted to it, apparently. Right? Jews were very interested in Greek philosophy and Greek culture, and ancient Greek philosophy. This is pre-Rambam. And the rabbis have a huge problem with this, because this is like foundationally oppositional to Jewish belief, which is no, God created an ordered universe, right? God is the cause of everything that functions. And so they are very, very troubled by that. And so the Greek word for those people becomes the term for heresy, right? So that's the first thing. You can't be an Epicurean. You need to believe that you're here for a reason, right? That there is a creator who imbued within you a soul, and that you are here, and that you exist daily at the beneficence and love and creative power of God. That idea can't exist in Epicurean philosophy. So that's the first idea, right? So you can't be doing that Greek stuff. And then the other two are a little bit more clear, right? Somebody who says the Torah doesn't come from heaven, which again tells us that clearly there were some people who were saying that, and somebody who says there's no resurrection of the dead from the Torah. Now, why is that important to know? Because if you read the Torah, at least on a pshat level, on a literal level, the Torah doesn't seem to say that, right? There's no moment in the Torah where there's any resurrection at all, right? That doesn't happen anywhere in the Torah. So you can imagine people were saying, by the time that people started talking about resurrection, you can imagine people saying like, hello, where's this coming from? And at some point, the rabbis are clearly trying to centralize kind of their religious worldview, which believes that there is resurrection and that it is grounded in Torah, that the Torah comes from heaven, and they're very anti kind of this Greek philosophy. Okay, I'm gonna pause there for a second, open the chat, and look at this. Yeah, Ezekiel, you're talking about the vision of the dry bones, right? So that's not Torah, right? It's Tanakh. And it doesn't seem to be like the resurrection that the rabbis would imagine, which is like a full bodily resurrection of all of us, right? Like en masse. There's also some weird ghost stuff in the Tanakh also that we're not supposed to do. So, but in the Torah, there's not any in the Torah. Yeah, Elisha's not in the Torah either. So this is like core Jewish theology, right? This kind of later forms a lot of the backbone of like Rambam's philosophy, right? On kind of like the foundational beliefs that every Jew must have. So let's look at the commentaries. And our goal right here is to ask the question, given that we already know that you can bring a high degree of personal worldview, where are the limits of it, right? Where are the boundaries of it? And right now we've seen, at least just in the Mishnah alone, we've seen that like, yeah, there are things even if you believe them, they exist very much on the outside of the system. So let's look at Rashi's commentary on this and see kind of what he adds and if it changes it in any way around this. Who would like to read? Gita, do you want to read Rashi right here? And we might stop and go as we go through here.
That's fine. One who says there is no resurrection of the dead from the Torah denies the teachings expounded in the Midrashim, as the Gemara later queries. From where do we derive the resurrection of the dead from the Torah?
Okay, so the Talmud, the Gemara asks this very question, right? The Talmud's also kind of curious, like, where do we get this from? And there's a concept, this is a good concept to know in kind of Talmud, called Hava Amina. Hava Amina is like, it's just core to the structure of the Talmud. You've seen this everywhere, all of the Torah, and it's like the unstated assumption, right? So whenever the Talmud like asks a question or is trying to prove it, there's an unstated assumption underneath it. And so what's the unstated assumption in this question, right? The question the Gemara asks is, where do we derive the resurrection of the dead from the Torah? What do you think the Hava Amina is, the unstated assumption?
That people are asking it.
And why would they be asking it?
Because it's not clear from where, right?
Right,
Otherwise,
because it's not there, right? So the Hava Amina isn't resurrection of the dead not in the Torah, right? That's the Hava Amina. And so we've seen tons of these in all of our Talmud study. The Talmud generally has this kind of like unstated assumption that it's going to then prove against that, right? It's usually going to go in the other direction, right? So it's like the unstated rhetorical question. And so the Hava Amina here is the Torah doesn't talk about resurrection of the dead. Right? Okay, Venix.
Jesse, can I just get a foundation to something? Did the people around where the rabbis were, the other religions, the other of the others, did they believe that there was resurrection after the dead?
Great question. So, what is the dominant culture around the rabbis? It's is Zoroastrian. Well, first of all, it's several. In the Talmud, it's Zoroastrianism, right? They're living in the Persian Empire. And so they're surrounded by Zoroastrianism, which, I don't know, let's find out right now. Zoroastrianism, resurrection. Let's see what the internet says. Was resurrection a Zoroastrian thing? Does seem to be, right? Does seem to be a little bit about it. That's like a very quick cursory search. So I don't know, I can't speak to like all of that, but Zoroastrianism believes in resurrection of the dead. And pre that, like when you go further back in time to the time of the Mishnah, we're talking about like Greek and Roman thought. So like paganism and Christianity. So Christianity believes in resurrection, big time, right? And so the rabbis have kind of like a vested interest in presenting an opposing version of that. So yeah, they're definitely familiar with it. And so maybe that might lead us to say maybe one of the things they're doing is like creating the Jewish version of that, given that it doesn't seem to be in the Torah itself. So that's the Hava Amina, right? Doesn't the Torah not say anything about that? And Rashi here is pointing us to the fact that the Gemara asks that and says like, yeah, but it comes up in the Midrash. So the rabbis do lots of interpretive moves to try and point to what's the text in the Torah that clues us towards that there is resurrection of the dead. And that becomes, whether or not we kind of agree with that move, and Peter, as you pointed out, there are plenty of people who don't agree with that interpretive move, it becomes normative for the rabbis, right? It becomes very much a part of normative rabbinic thought that there is resurrection of the dead, and you can source it from the Torah. It requires kind of a midrashic interpretation, but you can get there. And so therefore, somebody who denies resurrection of the dead, it's not just the idea itself, but you're denying the capacity of the rabbis to make that interpretive move. And maybe that's even more significant, right? Is that it's not like, even though today we might say it is in traditional Jewish thought that resurrection of the dead is kind of a fundamental part of traditional Jewish theology, but perhaps at the time, it wasn't that belief itself that was important. It was the rabbi's ability to make that interpretation. And so questioning whether or not it comes from the Torah is questioning the rabbi's authority. And that's important for us because we're asking where are the boundaries around your ability to interpret yourself. And now here we've seen one, like, yeah, you can bring your own worldview, but don't contradict the accepted authority's worldview in the bringing of your, right? So we've bumped up against that. Okay, Gita, go on. Even if
he acknowledges and believes that the dead will come to life, but claims that it is not hinted at in the Torah, he is considered a complete denier.
Okay, so wait a minute. Even if you say, all right, fine, I believe that there's resurrection of the dead, but it's not in the Torah. You're a complete denier, right? It's very strong. And that's exactly what we were just talking about, right? That like, it's not actually the belief itself. It's accepting that the rabbis had the authority to find the source in the Torah, to do that interpretation. And so even if you say, okay, I believe in resurrection of the dead, but I don't believe that it comes from the Torah, you're out of bounds. Mom.
Yeah, I guess the word that jumped out at me here was hinted. And if that's a good translation, I think it's the rabbi saying, you need to trust us. We have found something that that proves this for us. It may not be so black and white or so clear for you, but we know it's in there. Even though the actual words, resurrection, blah, 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 do not appear in the Torah.
Yes, hint is a good. In fact, that's a great one. Some of you may be familiar. I'm putting this in the chat with the acronym Pardes, which literally means orchard, but in rabbinic thought is the interpretive model or pedagogy par excellence. And hold on one sec. No, not trash, drash. And it's an acronym for these 4 Hebrew terms: pshat, remez, drash, sod. Pshat means literal, right? So that's like, what does the text itself literally say? Let's skip to drash. Drash means interpretation, right? Midrash. And that means what does the text mean when it's different from what it says? We've seen many examples of that in our studies together. So that's kind of like the second layer down. Remez is what's here in the Rashi, and a remez is a hint. So sometimes the Torah will use words that later interpreters use to leap to another idea or to another text somewhere else. And sod means secret, and that's like the highest mystical levels of interpretation of the text. So Rashi is saying here that the idea that resurrection can be found in the Torah is existing at the level of remez. Yeah, drash would be allegory, right? So the literal, the allegorical, the kind of like the hint to another idea that's coming from somewhere else, and then sod, like the highest, kind of most esoteric, mystical teachings of the text. And this is like the paradigm of Jewish text study, and that's one of the things that Rashi and the Gemara are pointing out, is that like once this idea becomes kind of centralized and accepted, it becomes heretical to push against it. Alex Vanix.
Do the rabbis give a hint to the normal mortals on what they found in the Torah that supports the theory of resurrection of the dead, or do we have to accept that they found it and the margin is too small for this annotation?
Yeah, maybe we'll flag this, and when we finish Sneud, maybe this would be like a fun thing to come back and look at, since it's like it's kind of like one of the biggies. They do, right? That's the Gemara that Rashi's pointing to, is that like the rabbis of the Gemara really do spend a lot of interpretive time trying to make that move. Yeah. Danix.
I have a huge problem with all of this.
No surprise.
I mean, our liturgy, the liturgy that we read, has removed, let me rephrase that. Up until the publication of Mishkan, Mishkan Tefillah, there was no indication at all in our liturgy of the resurrection of the dead. Now, the new book, Mishkan Tefillah, which is still 30 years old almost now, brings Mechaye Hametim back into the liturgy, but in brackets. And I mean, this seems to assume that it has to be in there, and that's why I have that's why I have a problem, because if you look at this in conjunction with the Mishnah, we are all heretics. We being Jews.
Yeah,
and
that's correct.
I don't like to be called a heretic.
No, for good reason. This was one of the big schisms in Germany, when the kind of the modern movements really kind of staked out their claims, right? This was one of the things, right? It wasn't egalitarianism, right? Early Reform Judaism was not egalitarian. It was like this was one of the big things, and yes, the perception of this from the others, from kind of the other perspective, is heresy. Now you can, what we're looking at right now is the crystallization of that as foundational. And so what you know by looking at this is that wasn't always the case. So without really going too far down the hole on this, because I want to get to the last little bit of Rambam here, I'll just say one thing. First of all, there's plenty of ways to interpret what does Tichiyat HaMetim actually mean, right? What does resurrection of the dead actually mean? Is it literal? Is it, we see lots of examples in kind of biology around us of plenty of forms of life which do seem to undergo some period of resurrection. We have a resurrection fern downstairs that we've had for 10 years that is dead, and then you add some water to it and it comes back to life. So one way of understanding it is, well, we don't seem to have any evidence of like bodily resurrection of human beings walking around. We're also finite creatures with limited cognitive processes, and who knows, right? That's one way of getting around this. Another way of getting around it is to say it's allegory and it's metaphor, right? What's the bracha you say after you see someone who you haven't seen in like 10 years? You say mechayeh hemetim, because it's as if they were dead to you, right? So the rabbis themselves understand that like sometimes death is allegorical and is not literal. So there's lots of ways to kind of like massage it out today. And one of the other ways is to look at these very texts we're looking at right now, which show us that this wasn't always the case. Like clearly at some point, this was a new idea which entered into Jewish thought. And there was a version of Judaism that didn't incorporate that. Now, that's not necessarily like a way of saying, and therefore I don't have to believe this, but it is a way of understanding like what's the evolution of Jewish thought. And the important part for us that I want to reiterate, and I don't want us to lose sight of, is and not whether or not like this belief actually is foundational, right? But look at the rabbis trying to stake out a claim over what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And the Rashi is so interesting because the Rashi right here shows us that you can have, like, he's not saying you're not allowed to have that opinion. He's just saying that like normative Judaism doesn't accept him, right? So you would have placed yourself outside the bounds. But look at the intricacies of what he's saying, where it's not about the belief itself. It's about whether or not you accept the rabbi's authority to make that claim. And that's important for our learning because we have already said you're allowed to bring in external opinion and external knowledge, and you're allowed to bring in Greek philosophy, right? Rambam calls it philosophy. He uses a Greek term. You are absolutely allowed to have that inform your perspective, and there are limits. And so we're seeing now here where some of those limits are. Gita, will you take us to the end of this Rashi, since he rejects?
Right. Since he rejects that there is a resurrection of the dead from the Torah, what benefit do we have from his belief?
I think you're muted. Oh, you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Oh, can you
hear me?
There we go.
You're good. Yeah,
okay.
All good.
Since he rejects that there is a resurrection of the dead from the Torah, what benefit do we have from his belief? And how does he know that this is the case? Therefore, he is a complete denier.
Yeah, it's just like, it's like this little, like twist the knife in, right? After you like, benefit for him, right? Like we don't need you, right? Like you've placed yourself outside the bounds. And I just want to say one thing. Listen, there are plenty of spaces in Jewish life today where, like, first of all, you're probably not being policed. Even if you enter into a space where this is normative thoughts, nobody's kind of like checking at the door like, hey, you, do you believe in the resurrection? It's not really what we do. Why? Because we're not a universalizing tradition, right? So we're not asking people to like make this creed. even though Rambam tries to do that, right? It's in his 13 principles. And what happened when he created those principles? People were furious at him. Right? What do you mean you want us to like make these declarations of things that we believe? We're Jewish. We're not Christian or Muslim. We're Jewish. So one is that, like, for the most part, people aren't like checking off, right? Like if you go to an Orthodox shul, right? Like nobody's going to ask you if you actually believe this. Like certainly not to police whether or not you're allowed to be there. And B, there are plenty of places where like you know, this is not normative. In fact, I would say certainly in North America, it is not mainstream Judaism to believe this, right? And then there's like a middle ground of like, I just don't think about it that much, right? Is the kind of like the middle space around all of that. So don't dwell too much on whether or not you have to believe in resurrection of the dead, but do pay attention to how strongly there are boundaries put up around the limits of interpretive permission. Right? Okay, Vanix, and then we're going to look at the last text for today.
I mean, I understand what you're saying about all of their various gradations of the terminology, but if you look at Rashi and you look at what he's saying, isn't the last thing he says absolutely? Well, it seems to me to be an absolute. Therefore, he is a complete denier.
Yeah.
And
yeah, he's not just a kofar, he's a complete kofar. Yeah.
Exactly. And yeah. If that's so, then to extrapolate from that, isn't he actually saying you have to believe that there's resurrection of the dead?
Yeah. Yes, Rashi is saying that, and so is the Talmud. And so, right? Yes. And by the time of Rashi, that's pretty standard, right? It is, right? You know, we live in a time where you don't have to buy into that. You personally don't have to accept the authority of Rashi. Let's just do a teeny bit of like history here. You know, up until fairly recently in the like history of Judaism, while personal belief, there was plenty of room for it in varying degrees. You know, you basically had to live within the boundaries of the community in which you found yourself. And there's really no way out of that, right? Like it was dangerous to move somewhere else. There was no such thing as secularism, right? Like secularism is a completely modern idea. The idea that you could just like become not anything is non-existent up until 300 years ago or so, right? So you were basically locked in to whatever kind of Jewish community you happened to be born into. Now, internally, whatever was happening within you was between you and God. And Rashi here is representative of basically normative Judaism worldwide, right? Up until the Enlightenment and the impact that has on Judaism, right? And that's where you can start leaving. Now I can leave the community. But why is Rashi clamping down so hard? Because you can't leave the community. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? I mean, you could convert to Christianity, right? You could do that. And then you just have to go believe in a different version of resurrection, right? So there's nowhere to go. So the communal boundaries aren't like today, right? I guess, Peter, like maybe the Hava Amina, right? The like unstated assumption under what you're saying and of why this feels problematic to you is like, well, who are you to say this? If I don't want to believe this, I don't have to believe this. Sure, that's true. But up until very, very, very recently, you had nowhere to go. What are you going to do? Right? So when we're talking about this is actually a good point to make, that when we're talking about interpretive boundaries, right? Like, what are the limits of what I'm allowed to think and say and interpret the text? But there is a connection to social boundaries, right? They're related to each other. And we actually haven't talked about that. So that's great. And that's a very good connection to snooze when we get there, right? Is because a lot of that is about social boundaries. How do I look like other people? How do we kind of create the norms of our community? Mom. And then we're going to do Rambam. Okay.
So I'm thinking about how a belief in an afterlife of some sort is a motivation to live a certain way in this particular life. And if the rabbis are, have that in mind, and that they see people who don't believe in their version of what happens after life as being on a slippery slope. And, relating to what you're saying about keeping the community cohesive. So if you start thinking this way, that, that there's no resurrection or there's no olam haba of some sort, then that's going to have some effect on the way you behave in this life. In a way that kind of relates back to the Epikuros too. So that if you don't kind of buy into this idea that there's a master plan, God has a master plan, and the olam haba and resurrection are part of that, it's not only not good for you, it's not good for the community, it's not good for the authority of the rabbis.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice line. Listen, the last thing that I just want to say on the subject of resurrection of the dead is this is not the thrust. This is not what most Jews and rabbis and are spending most of their time talking about, right? There's a selection bias here. I put this text here, right? I could have put a different text about interpretive boundaries. I put this one partly because it seems extreme to us, right? So it's actually a good way of looking at how firm those boundaries are. This is not what most rabbis are spending their days going around talking about and teaching about it, interpreting, right, when they create their drashes on the Torah. So it feels very punchy, particularly to a liberal audience who might not believe this, but this is not the thrust of Jewish thought. And that's where I open compared to Christianity or Islam, where it is, right? It really is, very much one of the front and center things that is meant to guide every moment of your life. Whereas for us, not so much, right? It's there, but it's really not on the front burner. Hopefully that turns down the boiling heat a little bit for those of you who don't like it. Okay, let's read the Rambam, and that'll close us out. For today. Alex, can you read the Rambam? This is from his commentary on the Mishnah, and he wrote a commentary on the entire Mishnah, or for most of it, actually. Just a little interesting biological tidbit about Rambam. He basically sketched out his entire life's project by the time he was 30. He, had the Guide for the Perplexed and his commentary on the Mishnah and the Mishnah Torah. He had basically had it all done by the time he was 30, which is just depressing for me and astounding, right? Don't compare yourself to the room, but we're here reading him 1,000 years later, and he, we kind of have this image in our heads of he's this sage with a beard, and he says no, he was a 30-year-old pisher, right? So, okay, yeah, Alex.
Well, and I have already said many times that when there is a dispute among the sages regarding matters of hashkafa and wisdom, its purpose is not determined by practical actions, since one does not assert the halakha is according to so and so.
Okay, so first of all, I as we read these, hopefully we're starting to understand the personality, right? People, right? We're starting to understand the personalities, and Rambam sometimes has this very I don't know, maybe it's condescending or he's certainly highfalutin. It's I already told you this many times, right? You see this come up a lot. It's part of the vernacular. When you read other Arabic philosophy and Jewish philosophy from that time, it's totally standard. But you do get a little bit of his kind of his philosophy of saying, yeah, and remember, guys, I already told you this. So we see a little bit of his personality. And then let's look at what he's saying here, that when there is a dispute, right, when there's a disagreement regarding hashkafa and wisdom, okay, so if we're trying to figure out what am I allowed to do? Whose opinion am I allowed to bring in here? Am I taking his opinion or his opinion? What's the difference between hashkafa and wisdom, right? How do you determine it? Okay, so that's the open question here. What's he saying how you would resolve such a dispute?
Seems halakha wins, right? Like, there's no, it's not about the hashkafa, it's not about your opinion. In the end, the law wins, doesn't it?
What clues you to that?
We don't assert the halakha is according to so-and-so. The halakha is, right? It's not based on somebody's opinion. This is, halakha just is.
Okay, so one way of interpreting what the Rambam is saying here is that we don't assert that the halakha is according to so-and-so. So maybe the assumption is it just is. Okay, now one of the things we would have to do then is like contrast that with what Rambam said, which we read last week, where now this is in a different part of the text, right? But here he clearly says, well, we kind of do accept opinions that come from other places. There's an interesting contrast there. Right? Now, there's some ways around that. One way is to say they're actually not in contrast. Another way is to say he changed his mind in between writing these two texts. And there is some scholarship on like looking at the Rambam's life and when he wrote things and how his opinion did change over time. Well,
Yeah, I'm wondering if this is more about recognizing, excuse me, that it's not enough just to rely on a halachic pronouncement and say, well, this is the way it is because, excuse me, Rabbi so-and-so said it. That this is sort of coming down on the side of looking beneath the surface, looking at subtleties, looking at hashkafa. So it's a matter of perspective when you're making a decision. But it's a little bit of a circular argument, I suppose, because I guess what I'm saying is, like, if it's a dispute regarding matters of hashkafa and wisdom, you have to interrogate it through the principles of hashkafa and wisdom.
Okay, good. Let's follow that, and then we're going to go to Don in a second. You said if it's a dispute between hashkafa and halacha, you have to interrogate it through the principles of hashkafa. Yeah,
not exclusively, but I guess what this is saying to me, I guess what it's saying to me is you can't rely only on a rabbinic pronouncement, and there's many of those. You also have to look at context and contemporaneous perspectives.
well, that's what he said upstairs, right? In the other text where he said looking at other sources. He's not saying that here. Maybe one of the things to look at for this text is what he's not saying. He's not saying in a dispute between hashkafa and halacha, go with halacha. He doesn't say that. So we might imagine that he did. So he's not ruling out hashkafa, which is why I think, Mom, you're on the right track with this idea that like you have to interrogate the hashkafa through its own principles, right? I think you're on the right track there. Because he is not saying when there is a dispute between your personal interpretation and the written word of halacha or the oral text of halacha, go with halacha. He's not saying that. He's saying, what is he saying? She'ein tachlita ma'aseh min ha'ma'asim, that you don't determine the purpose of the whole thing by practical actions. Meaning, let's set this up almost theatrically. If you were watching other people's behavior, right? You're watching other people make Jewish decisions. You, as the observer, don't make your decisions or your understanding of purpose just by looking at the outcome. Does that make sense? If you're watching how other people act Jewishly. Just watching them is not enough to tell you what their hashkafa is, because you haven't asked them and you don't understand it. And you can imagine, this is one of the ways that human beings learn, right? We imitate. It's called mimesis, right? And like Jews do this all the time. You go to a new Jewish community that you've never been to and you don't really know what the rules are. So you kind of just like copy people, right? It's like a totally normal human developmental thing, right? Of how we learn and how we practice and we experiment. And one of the things the Rambam is saying here is doing that doesn't actually tell you enough about why that decision was made. The purpose is not determined by its practical actions. So I think, Mom, you're right. You have to do what you're suggesting, and that's you have to actually understand how that decision came to be made. And you can't determine it just by the outcomes. So when there's a debate or a dispute, it's not just about the upshot at the of like practically what happens. You have to go back to the core principles. Why are you making that decision? And that is like totally Rambam, right? Like go back to the core philosophical ideas, and that's where you have the debate. Dawn.
So I've been absorbing a lot of this and trying to figure out what I feel about it. But it seems to me that this entire experience is setting up the rabbis as the top of the Judaic food chain, so to speak, in terms of how we get answers to our questions. And I think that that's what this is doing. Both Rashi and Rambam have done that. If we have a question that we don't quite understand how to deal with with what we're doing, we go to a rabbi. And the rabbi will then give us their personal hashkafa or their interpretation of hashkafa.
Yes.
And then we choose to either follow that Rabbi, that Rav, or we choose to follow a different Rav and their hashkafa, right? And I'm struck by, it reminded me of a scene in Fiddler on the Roof. I don't usually use Fiddler as a backdrop for anything, but there's the scene at the wedding where Perchik wants to dance with Huddle, and they go to the rabbi because they say dancing with a woman, well, it's not expressly forbidden, right? And so all of a sudden Perchik says, see, it's not forbidden, we can do it. But the rabbi didn't really say that, did he? He says it's not really forbidden, but you know, sort of thing. So
and one, I love that you brought that, because there is a certain critique of a certain kind of traditionalist orientation in Judaism that it's like lacking integrity, because if you don't like the answer you get from one rabbi, you just go to another. There is a certain critique to that. And I want to redeem a little bit of that approach to say what it's actually doing is embodying a lot of the values of autonomy that liberal Jews claim to be the holders of, and saying, no, actually, the system itself grants us wide latitude in interpretation, where the boundaries are around is less about ideas and more about how you come to hold those ideas. Now, there are flat, you can't say, I have interpreted that there is a Holy Trinity. No, of course you can't do that, right? Those boundaries do exist. But really where the boundaries are around is how you come to make those ideas rather than the ideas themselves. And I think that redeems a lot of the critique of, well, you're just going to find the rabbi who gives you the answer you're looking for. The charitable interpretation is you're looking for the Jewish world that kind of coheres with you a lot, that yes, pushes you and encourages you to do spiritual growth, but like that actually fits in with how you look at the world. You want a rabbi who understands how you look at things and helps you understand, you know, how Judaism can look at things also that way. And that's, I think, the Rambam's last point here is when he says one doesn't assert the halacha is according to so-and-so, he's not saying that individuals, the so-and-so, doesn't get to interpret halacha. What he's saying is, if you just saw someone behaving a certain way, you don't get to say, well, I get to do that too, because I saw them do that, right? You don't get to do that. Why? Because you actually don't know how that person came to formulate those ideas and act on them in some way. So what do you have to do? You have to go through a process of that period of learning and discovery and thought. we are seeing the end of our time together, as there is a small child coming up and getting ready for her nap, and we're past 10 o'clock. So we'll pick this next week and come back and do a little bit of a review of this. But hopefully one of the things today has shown is kind of where those boundaries are around the edges of like how much personal interpretation are you allowed to do? And the answer is a lot, but there are bumps. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great week. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see everyone next week.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.